I was 19 the winter they sent me to Alder Grove. I remember thinking it was a punishment. You have to understand, every young guardsman wants the palace. You want the gates, the crowds, the cameras. You want tourists photographing you while you stand there pretending you can't see them. That's the job you dream about when you sign up. Nobody dreams about a cold stone house at the end of a glen where nothing ever happens. That's what Aldergrove was, or what I thought it was. A house at the end of the world, gray walls, gray sky. A river you could hear but not always see, running fast and brown under the mist. And around it, hills that went up and up until they disappeared into cloud, so that some mornings you couldn't tell where the land stopped and the weather began. Let me tell you about the house first, because the house matters. The house is the whole thing, really. Aldergrove had belonged to Queen Elowen, her private home, not a working palace, not a place for state dinners or foreign visitors. It was hers, the one place in the whole kingdom that wasn't shared with anybody. She'd gone there every autumn for near enough 60 years since she was a girl, and people said she was more herself there than anywhere else. No crown, no cameras, just her and her dogs and the hills. She died in the spring before I came. In her own bed, they said, in her own room, with the window open so she could hear the river. 89 years old. The whole kingdom stopped. I was still in training then, and I remember the sergeant instructor turning off the drills and the lot of us standing in the yard in the rain, not knowing what to do with our hands. Grown men crying and pretending they weren't. And after she died, they sealed the house. That's the part people don't understand when I tell them. They sealed Aldergrove, locked it, left it exactly as it was on the morning she passed, her reading glasses still on the side table, her boots still by the back door, a half-finished letter still on her writing desk, they said, though I never saw it, not then. The order came down from the very top, and the order was simple. The house was not to be touched, not opened, not cleared, not changed, not by anyone. Until when? Nobody would say. That was the strange part. Usually there's a reason, a date, a plan, a will being sorted, but this was just sealed, waiting, like the house itself was holding its breath. And they posted guards on it, around the clock, 2 men at a time, changing every few hours, all through the day and all through the Black Highland night. That's where I came in. Little Jory Vane, 19, fresh out of training, sent to guard an empty house that nobody was ever going to enter anyway. Or so I thought. The man in charge of us at Aldergrove was Sergeant Edmund Reeve. I need to get him right for you, because if you don't understand Reeve, none of the rest of it will land the way it should. He was old, not old like your granddad's old, old like a tree is old. 61, 62, somewhere in there, though he never said and you'd never dare ask. Big hands, a face like the weather had been working on it for years and had mostly won. He didn't smile much. When he did, it was small, and it went away fast, like he'd caught himself doing something he shouldn't. Reeve had served the Queen for 40 years. 40 years, think about that. He'd been a young man, younger than me, when he first stood a post for Queen Elowen. He'd guarded her at the palace, at the great houses, on her travels. And in the last stretch of her life, when she stopped going to the crowded places and only wanted Aldergrove, he'd come here with her. He was one of the ones she knew by name, one of the handful she'd nod to, or say good morning to, or ask about his family. He was there the morning she died. I learned that later. He was on the post outside her window the morning she died, and he heard them come running, and he knew before they said a word. After that, he could have retired. He'd earned it 3 times over. They offered it to him, I heard. A cottage, a pension, a quiet life. And he turned it down. He asked instead to be posted to Aldergrove, to the sealed house, to stand guard over an empty home in an empty glen for whatever was left of his career. Some of the lads thought that was mad. I did too, at first. Why would a man choose the loneliest post in the kingdom over a warm retirement? I understood it eventually. It took me a while, but I understood it. He wasn't guarding a house. He was still guarding her. It was the last thing left he could do for her, and he wasn't going to let anybody take it from him. The days at Aldergrove were long, and they were all the same. You'd get up before light. The cold in that place got into your bones in a way I'd never felt before, a wet cold, a cold with weight to it. You'd wash in water that made your teeth ache. You'd dress, and then you'd go out and stand. Standing a post at an empty house is a strange thing. At the palace, you've got the crowds to give you something to push against. The tourists, the noise, the poor souls trying to make you laugh. At Aldergrove there was nothing. Just you and the wall behind you and the glen in front of you and the hours. You learned to fill the hours in your head. I'd count the birds. I got good at the birds, the grouse breaking cover down the slope, the buzzards turning slow circles up high, the little brown things whose names I never learned flitting in the heather. I'd watch the light change on the hills. On a clear day it'd move across them like something alive, gold and then green, and then a kind of purple as the evening came down. And I'd watch Reeve. He never seemed to feel the hours the way I did. He'd stand a post for 3 hours straight without shifting his weight, without a sound, his eyes moving slow across the ground in front of him, perfectly still. And then his relief would come, and he'd hand over without a word and go inside for his tea and come back out and do it all again. The only time he ever changed was when he passed the house. There was a path that ran along the front of Aldergrove between the gravel drive and the wall. When Reeve walked it, and he walked it every day, twice, morning and evening, checking the doors, checking the windows, checking that everything was as it should be, he'd slow down as he passed the tall window on the south side, the one that looked into her sitting room. He'd slow and he'd look in just for a second, just a glance, and then he'd carry on. I asked him about it once. Early on, before I knew better, I said, "Sergeant, what's in there? The room you always look at." He was quiet so long I thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he said, "Her chair." That was all, her chair. And the way he said it, I never asked him anything again. I want to tell you about one evening in particular, because it's the one that sticks. And because it tells you something about him. It was late autumn, the first real cold. There was a thin skin of ice on the water butts in the morning, and the heather had gone brown and brittle, and you could smell winter coming the way you can smell rain before it falls. Reeve and I were on the evening post together. The light was going, and a stag came down out of the hills. A great red stag, the biggest I'd ever seen, with a rack of antlers like something out of an old painting. It came down slow, picking its way through the heather, and it stopped maybe 40 feet from us, and it looked at us. Long, steady. The way animals look at you sometimes and you feel like they know something you don't. I moved to reach for, I don't know what I was reaching for. Nothing really, just the instinct to do something, and Reeve put his hand on my arm. Barely touched me, just enough to say, "Don't." We stood there, the three of us, the stag and Reeve and me, and the light died out of the glen around us until the stag was just a shape against the hill, and then it turned, unhurried, and went back up the way it had come. And Reeve said, very quiet, almost to himself, she loved to watch them from the window. She'd sit for hours. I didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say. That was Aldergrove. That was the whole of it. A dead woman's house and an old man's grief, and me in the middle of it, not yet understanding what I was seeing. I thought nothing would ever happen there. I was wrong. It was the middle of December when the cars came. I remember because we'd had the first snow, a proper fall, 6 inches of it, turning the whole glen white and soft and silent. The kind of snow that makes the world hold still. Reeve and I had been out clearing the drive that morning, our breath smoking in the cold, and I'd been happy, actually happy, in a way I couldn't have explained to anyone. And then just past noon, I heard the engines. You could hear a long way at Aldergrove. Sound carried over the snow, and what I heard was engines, more than one, big ones, coming up the glen road that ran for 6 miles between us and the nearest village. Nobody drove that road. In 2 months I'd seen maybe a dozen vehicles on it, and all of them were ours. Reeve heard it too. I saw his head come up. Saw something go across his face. I couldn't read it then, but I can now. It was the face of a man who'd been expecting bad news for a long time and had just heard it coming up the road. "Sergeant," I said. He didn't answer straight away. He was listening, counting the engines, I think. Then the first car came round the shoulder of the hill, black against the snow, and behind it another, and behind that a third. Big black cars, the official kind, moving slow and careful on the icy road. And on the front of the lead car, a small flag, snapping in the cold. I didn't know the flag, but Reeve did. I heard him let out a breath, slow, and he said one word, low, the way you'd say the name of a storm you'd hoped would pass you by. "Rowena." I need to tell you who Rowena was. Because at 19, stuck at the end of a glen, I only half knew, and what I knew was mostly what everybody knew, which is to say, the gossip. Duchess Rowena was the new king's wife. King Haldan, Queen Aloin's son. He'd taken the throne when his mother died, a gray-haired man himself by then, and he'd done it with Rowena at his side, his second wife. He'd married her only a few years before, after a first marriage that had ended badly and publicly, and the whole kingdom had opinions about it. Rowena wasn't loved. That's the plain truth. Half the country blamed her for things that maybe weren't her fault, and the other half just didn't warm to her, and she carried all of that with her wherever she went. You could see it in the photographs. A woman braced for a room to turn cold. And now here she was, coming up the glen in the snow, to the one house in the kingdom that had been sealed shut and left to the dead woman it belonged to. The cars stopped on the drive we'd cleared that morning. Doors opened. Men in dark coats got out first, her people, aides and security, moving quick and businesslike, their shoes crunching in the snow. And then from the middle car, the Duchess herself. She was smaller than I expected, wrapped in a long dark coat with a fur collar, a scarf up around her chin. Her face was pale and her mouth was set in a hard line, and she looked at the house at Aldergrove, gray and shut and silent under its cap of snow, with an expression I couldn't read. It wasn't warmth, but it wasn't nothing either. One of her aides came toward us. A thin man, sharp, the kind who's always got a phone in his hand. He looked at Reeve and he looked at me, and he decided Reeve was the one who mattered. "Sergeant," he said, "Her Grace will be entering the house. Have the doors opened." And Reeve said, "No. I want you to imagine it. A young man like me standing there in the snow, watching a sergeant of 40 years' service tell a duchess's man, a man who spoke for the king's own wife, no. Just like that, flat. Not rude, not raised, just no." The aide blinked. I don't think anyone had said no to him in a long time. "I'm sorry," he said, in the voice men use when they're not sorry at all. "Perhaps you don't understand. This is the Duchess Rowena. She's here at the king's, she's here to view the property. The doors will be opened." "The house is sealed," Reeve said. "By order, it's not to be entered, not by anyone." "That order," the aide said, "does not apply to Her Grace." "It applies to everyone," Reeve said. "That's what sealed means." They looked at each other, and I remember thinking, this can't be happening. You can't do this. You can't just say no to these people. That's not how any of it works. There are rules, and the rules run in one direction, and it's not the direction of a gray-haired sergeant at the end of a glen. The aide's jaw tightened. He turned and walked back toward the cars, back toward the Duchess, and I watched him bend and speak to her, and I watched her listen, and I watched her look past him, over his shoulder, straight at Reeve. And then she came herself. She came across the snow, her aides trailing behind her, and she stopped a few feet from Reeve, and up close I could see her better. She was older than the photographs, tired around the eyes. There was snow melting in the fur of her collar, and when she spoke, her voice was quieter than I expected and steadier. "You're Reeve," she said. He didn't answer, but something crossed his face. She knew his name. That surprised him, I think. "My husband speaks of you," she said. "The old guard from the glen, the one his mother trusted." A pause. "She trusted very few people, he told me that." Reeve stood like the wall behind him. "Ma'am," he said, "just that." "I want to go inside, Reeve," she said. "I need to. I won't take long. I won't touch anything I shouldn't." And then, lower, almost to herself, "There's something in there that I have to find." And that "there's something in there I have to find," that was the thing that changed it all, though none of us knew it yet. Reeve didn't move. "With respect, ma'am," he said, "the house was sealed by the late Queen's own wish. I was there when the order was given. I heard it from her own physician who heard it from her. Nothing to be touched, nothing to be taken. The house to stay as she left it until—" He stopped. "Until when?" the Duchess said, quick, sharp, like she'd been waiting for exactly that word. "Until when, Reeve? That's what nobody will tell me. That's why I'm standing in the snow at the end of the world, sealed until when?" And for the first time I saw Reeve unsure. Because he didn't know, that was the thing, none of us knew. The house was sealed until, and there the order stopped. A door with no other side to it, sealed forever for all anyone could say. "I don't know, ma'am," he said, and it cost him something to say it. You could hear that it did. "No," she said, "nobody does." She pulled her scarf tighter. The snow was starting again, small hard flakes coming down out of a sky the color of ash. "So I'm going to go inside, Sergeant, and I'm going to find out, because I believe there's a letter, and I believe it's for me. I have to be honest with you about what happened next, because it doesn't make Reeve look the way you'd want your hero to look. Or maybe it does. Maybe it makes him look exactly right. I've gone back and forth on it for years." She went to the door. The front door of Aldergrove, oak and iron, with the seal on it, an actual seal, wax and ribbon over the lock. And she reached out and she put her hand on it. And Reeve stepped in front of her. Not touching her, he'd never have touched her. But he put himself between the Duchess and the door, his back to the oak, and he stood there and he said, "No, ma'am, I'm sorry, I can't let you." The aides surged forward. The sharp one was saying something about the king, about consequences, about did Reeve understand what he was doing. And behind me, I could feel the young lad who'd come up with the convoy, one of the Duchess's own guards, shifting, not knowing whose side he was meant to be on. And God help me, I stepped up beside Reeve. I don't know why I did it. I've never fully known. I was 19 and terrified, and I had no more idea what was going on than a dog does. But I looked at that old man standing his ground alone against the whole weight of the crown, and something in me just moved. I stepped up beside him, shoulder to shoulder, my back to the door, and I stood. He glanced at me, just a flick of the eyes, and I swear to you, small as it was, that look is one of the things I'm proudest of in my whole life. The Duchess looked at the two of us. Two guards, one old, one barely more than a boy, backs to a dead woman's door, snow coming down on all of us. And she said very quietly, "You'd really stop me. You'd actually stand here and stop me." "Yes, ma'am," Reeve said. "Why?" And there was something in her voice now that wasn't anger, something underneath it. "She's gone, Reeve, she's gone. What are you protecting? An empty house. A chair by a window. What difference does it make to her now, whether I go in or not?" And Reeve said the thing I've never forgotten. He said, "It makes no difference to her, ma'am. She's past all of it. It makes a difference to me. Because she asked me to keep her door, and I said I would. And a man's only as good as the last promise he means to keep." Nobody spoke for a moment. The snow came down. Somewhere down the glen the river ran on under the ice, the way it always had, the way it did before any of us were born and would long after. Then the Duchess did something none of us expected. She stepped back. She stepped back from the door, and she turned away. And for a second I thought she was leaving, that it was over, that Reeve had won and we'd all go back to our cold, quiet days, and the cars would carry her back down the glen and out of our lives. But she didn't leave. She stood with her back to us, looking out at the white hills, and when she spoke again her voice had changed completely. All the sharpness gone out of it. What was left was just tired. tired and something worse than tired. She never liked me, she said. You know that, everyone knows that. The whole country knows the old queen never took to me. A short laugh with no humor in it. She was polite. She was always perfectly polite. That was worse than if she'd been cruel. You can fight cruel, you can't fight polite. None of us said a word. But at the end, the Duchess went on, at the very end when she was here in this house dying, she sent for me. Did you know that, Reeve? She sent for me. Not Haldon, not the others, me, and I came. I drove up this same road in the spring and I sat with her, an old woman I was sure had spent 10 years despising me, and she took my hand. Her voice caught. She steadied it. And she said she was sorry. She said she'd been wrong about me. She said she'd written it all down, everything she wanted to say, everything she wished she'd said sooner, and she'd left it for me. In the house. She said, it's in the house and it'll wait for you, and when you're ready you'll find it. She turned around, and her face was wet, and she didn't wipe it, and she looked at Reeve like a woman with nothing left to lose. That's what I came for, she said. Not the silver, not the jewels. God knows I've got enough of those. I came for the last kind words of the only person in that family who ever, at the very end, decided to be kind to me. And you're standing in my way. I'll never forget Reeve's face. Because everything in it changed. All the hardness, all the set of his jaw, all the 40 years of no, it went out of him slowly, like water going out of a tide. And what was left underneath was just an old man who'd loved a woman he'd served, and had been keeping her door out of that love, and had just learned something that turned everything sideways. He said quietly, she sent for you in the spring. April, the Duchess said. The 14th. I know because I keep it. It's the last thing that mattered to me, and I keep the date. Reeve was very still. I was on the post that day, he said. The 14th of April. I remember a car came up. I remember thinking it was strange so near the end. Nobody was allowed up near the end, but this one was let through. He looked at her. That was you. That was me. And I watched it land on him. I watched him understand that the thing he'd been guarding, the sealed house, the untouched rooms, until had a name, and the name was standing in front of him in the snow, weeping, and he'd nearly turned her away. He was quiet for a long moment. The snow settled on his shoulders. Then he said, she told me near the end. She told me there'd be someone. She said, Edmund, keep it shut, but not forever. There's one who'll come, and when they come, you'll know, and you're to let them in. His voice went rough. I don't know what I thought. I thought I'd know some other way. A sign, something certain. I've been standing on this drive for 8 months waiting to know, and I didn't think it would be. He stopped. He couldn't finish it. He didn't have to. He'd been waiting for the one the Queen meant. And he'd almost sent her away, because she was the last person on earth he'd have guessed. He turned to the door. I watched him take out his knife, the small one, part of the kit, nothing dramatic, and I watched him cut the ribbon that held the seal. Careful. The way you'd cut a thread on something precious. The wax cracked and fell into the snow. And he took the great iron key that hung on the chain at his belt, the one I'd never once seen him use, and he put it in the lock, and he turned it, and the door of Aldergrove opened for the first time in 8 months. Cold air came out of it. That's the thing I remember. A breath of cold, still, old air, air that had been shut inside all that time, air that had been breathed by nobody. It smelled of wood smoke long gone cold, and of lavender and of dust, and underneath all of it, faintly, of a house that someone had once loved. Reeve stood aside. Ma'am, he said, and he inclined his head. Not a full bow. Reeve didn't do full bows for anyone but the one he'd served, but he inclined his head, and it meant the same thing. The Duchess looked at the open door, and now that it was open, now that she could go in, she seemed almost afraid to. She stood on the threshold a long moment. Then she said, without turning round, will you come with me? I don't want to do this alone, and I think you know where she'd have left it, better than I would. And Reeve went in with her. He looked back at me once. Vain, he said, the door, nobody else. Sergeant, I said. And I took my post at the open door, my heart going like a drum, and I stood there while the two of them went inside, and I kept the door, the way he'd taught me, the way she'd once asked him to. I didn't see what happened in the house. I only heard about it after in pieces from Reeve, who was never much for words, so I've had to fill in some of it myself over the years. But this is near enough how it went. He took her to the sitting room, the one with the tall window, her chair still there, angled toward the glass, toward the hills where the stags came down. And on the little writing desk in the corner, exactly where it had sat untouched for 8 months, was the half-finished letter I'd heard about but never seen. Except it wasn't half-finished. That was just the story that had grown up around it. It was finished. It was sealed in an envelope and propped against the lamp, and on the front of it, in the old queen's own hand, a hand gone shaky at the end but still hers, was written a single name. Rowena. Reeve told me the Duchess stood and looked at it for a long time before she could bring herself to pick it up. And when she did, her hands were shaking so hard she could barely open it. And she read it standing there in her dead mother-in-law's sitting room, in her coat, with the snow coming down outside the window. And by the end of it, she'd sunk down into the old queen's chair without seeming to know she'd done it. And she was weeping the way people weep when something they'd stopped hopping for finally comes. I don't know what the letter said. It wasn't mine to know, and Reeve never told me, and I never asked. Some doors you keep. But I know she was in that house near an hour, and I know that when she came out, she was a different woman than the one who'd gone in. The hardness was gone from her face. She looked, I don't know how to say it, she looked like someone who'd been forgiven, like someone who'd been carrying a great weight up a hill for years and had finally been allowed to set it down. She stopped in front of Reeve on the drive. The letter was in her hand. She'd hold onto that letter, I think, for the rest of her life. "You were right to stop me," she said. "Ma'am." "No, let me. You were right to stop me. Not because you knew who I was, you didn't, but because you'd have stopped anyone. You kept her door for a stranger you had every reason to turn away because you gave your word. Do you know how rare that is, Sergeant? In my life. Do you know how few people have ever kept anything for me when there was nothing in it for them?" Reeve didn't answer. I don't think he could. "I'm going to tell the king about you," she said. "Not to reward you. You'd hate that. I'm going to tell him because he should know what kind of man his mother trusted. He should know it was the right kind." She paused. "And the house, I'll see the seal restored. It should stay as she left it. She was right about that. Some things should be kept." She turned to go. Then she stopped, and she looked back at me, little Jory Vane, standing at the door, freezing, trying to look like I hadn't heard every word. "And you," she said, "you stood with him when you didn't have to, when it might have cost you everything." A small, tired smile, the first real one I'd seen from her. "You've got a good teacher. Learn from him." "Yes, ma'am," I managed. And then the cars carried her away, back down the glen, the way they'd come, black against the white, until the sound of the engines died away and there was nothing left but the snow and the river and the two of us standing on the drive. Reeve locked the door again. He put a new seal on it he'd radioed down and had one sent up, and he set the wax himself and pressed it and stood back. And then he did the thing he always did. He walked the path along the front of the house, slow, and at the tall window he stopped and he looked in at her chair. Except it was different this time. I could see it was different. Because he wasn't looking in at an empty room anymore. He was looking in at a room where the last thing had finally been done. The letter delivered. The door kept and then opened and then kept again. The promise finished, all the way to the end. "That's it then," he said, quiet almost to himself. "That's the last of it." He stood there a while longer. The light was going, the way it always went, gold and then green and then that deep highland purple, and the first stars were coming out hard and cold over the hills. Then he turned to me, and he did something he'd never done before, not once in all my time at Aldergrove. He put his hand on my shoulder. "You'll do," he said. 2 words, "you'll do." From Reeve it was the whole of the sky. He retired that spring. He'd stayed, I understood at last, for one reason, to be there when the Queen meant finally came. He'd been keeping the door open for the door to be opened, if that makes any sense. And once it was done, once the letter was in the right hands and the promise was kept whole, there was nothing holding him to that cold glen anymore. They gave him the cottage and the pension he'd turned down before, down south in gentler country where the winters don't get into your bones. I visited him once a few years on when I was a sergeant myself by then. He had a garden. He seemed smaller out of the uniform the way they always do, but his handshake was the same and his eyes were the same, and when I mentioned Aldergrove a stillness came over him, soft, not sad, the stillness of a man remembering something whole and finished. He died a few winters back. Peacefully, they told me, in his own bed, and I like to think I've no proof of it, but I like to think that somewhere on the other side of things there was an old woman waiting to nod at him, and to say good morning and to ask about his family the way she used to. Because if anyone earned it, he did. I still stand posts. I've stood every kind there is now, the palace, the gates, the crowds, all the ones I dreamed about as a boy. And they're grand, and I'm proud of them. But it's the cold one I think about. The empty house at the end of the glen, and the old man who chose it, and the day the Duchess came up the road in the snow, and an old guard with nothing to gain stood between her and a dead woman's door because he'd said that he would. People ask me sometimes what the Royal Guard really is, what it's actually about, underneath the uniforms and the ceremony and the tourists' cameras. And I always think of Reeve, standing his ground in the snow, guarding an empty room for the sake of a promise no one was watching him keep. That's what it's about. It was never really about the crown. It was about keeping the door.